welcome to Sweet Success. This is a series that's looking at CX practitioners and practices from an outside-in point of view. And today we have Shereen Qutoob, who is an expert and a senior executive in HR, talent management, and all things related. So we're going to get her perspective on how CX, EX plays in her world, and we'll start from there. But as we get started, Shereen, maybe you can just give us a quick rundown. What is your background?
Thanks, Alpha. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure connecting. What is my background? So not by design, so the HR space was never on my radar, let's say, by design. So by education, I'm actually an architectural engineer. So that was like my actual kind of study and background. But throughout the years, I moved more into media, communications, and I've always found myself gravitating towards people and just how people experience organization. So that's been the focus of my work, and that sort of lent me into the work of talent management, career development, coaching, training and development. So it's always been on the people side. If you ask me, like the processy pieces, not my thing, because again, I find that's where we're missing the people component. But that kind of in a nutshell.
Okay. And what industries have you worked in? You don't necessarily have to name the companies if you don't want to. If you want to, feel free. But what industries have you worked in?
Yeah, I would say so. Primarily, most of my career stint was in the oil and gas sector. And I think that's where the engineering background came in, and it helped me build credibility with that audience space. So it was not me as the HR person coming in that has no clue what drilling engineers are doing, but I try to kind of build that common language with them. So most of it has been in the oil and gas sector, a short stint in pharmaceuticals, and then in the chemical manufacturing industry for a bit of time, and then more in the retail space more recently, just entertainment, retail, which is a completely different industry altogether.
Okay, very nice, very nice. Okay, so I don't know if you call it a male-dominated industries, but quite a few of them, most of your career was in male-dominated industry. So that might be an interesting take to see if that has any play in what we're talking about. So let me start off with the first general question here on CX. So, I mean, you've oil and gas, not necessarily known as a powerhouse in CX, but what was the take on CX in your career and any of the companies that you work with? What was CX to you, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very honest. I think as a term, it didn't really come into my awareness until more recently with my recent organization that I'm working with. Because like you said, like in the oil and gas industry, it was not, as a term, it wasn't there. We understood that the customer was the focus because again, if the customer, is asking for certain drill time, rig time, that you just make sure your customer gets what they need. And there was a lot of emphasis there. I would say the pendulum didn't necessarily swing internally towards the employee experience as much because you were always catering for the customer because that's where the money was. And it was just, very, very high risk, high, kind of high impact, and that's where the focus of the organization was. So there was never really, at least in my awareness, a term called CX that I was aware of until more recently. But I guess it was kind of playing out in the background in some sort of way. Yeah.
Okay. And then so more recently, how many, I mean, when you say more formally, about how many years would you say you've kind of been, I don't know, mingling, dabbling, doing, practicing CX or EX?
Probably like the last 5 to 7 years, I would say, more predominantly. And that's where I started to see it on actual job titles. So that's where I was like, oh, this is an actual discipline. There's an actual function here. There's actual structure that goes behind it. So it wasn't in my mind before then, it was more kind of a subset of maybe marketing or maybe, employee experience wasn't really spoken about, to be fair, as much. Then I started to hear more around employer value proposition and employee experience. We need to map out journeys, and there was all this design thinking that had to go into that. So I would say the last more or less 7 years or so. If
Okay.
I'm, yeah, yeah.
Okay. And when you see those roles, did anything stand out to you? I mean, because I guess, when you think about accounting, I can picture the crux of what accounting is. If I picture engineering, I can kind of picture the crux of what engineering is. When you, based on, what you've seen, uh, think of customer experience roles, what is the crux of a customer experience role?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at it and now like it's more there's certain people that come to my mind that embody that. And so I can't really, like you said, like with engineering, it's kind of like there is a clear scope and a box there. It was more widely encompassing of many different facets of, whether it's the business, interactions with stakeholders, analytics and understanding customer insights. So it touched into different aspects that didn't really make it one specific. So that's why it was harder, at least for me, to pinpoint initially, like, oh, this is CX and this is not CX. And then I realized when I zoom out, I was like, well, it's all part of, the CX, kind of landscape, because you're
Hmm.
really looking at it as an end-to-end process, end-to-end journey. And that will touch several touch points from an interaction, whether it's front, like if I look at it from, let's say, in an entertainment industry per se, like maybe a cinema perspective. So it's both customer facing, the touch point where you're getting your popcorn. It's also back of house where you're dealing with how the system is working in terms of your bookings and so on. So that gave me like such a broader view of like this is so much bigger than I gave it credit for, to be really kind of humble and transparent. Like I did not realize like the extent of the work that CX touches.
Hmm.
And then when I look at people I've interacted with over the years, there are those individuals that have spanned more broader kind of perspectives. And then there are those that have really kind of zoned in on a certain subset where it was like customer insights was their thing. That was their game. And it was around the numbers and understanding the trends and the analytics. And they really kind of dove in there. So it offered kind of those two or just more, multiple perspectives of what a function could look like.
Right. And if I have this correct, you've done a lot in talent management. So basically, if I can kind of say what I when I think of talent management, it's sort of like from the organization's point of view, let's spot some talent. Let's make sure we get those people, try to nurture them so that they stay
Mhm.
with our organization. That's kind of the key thing, succession and all that sort of stuff. From based on what you just said, these two sort of the narrow CX where they find an area and they dive deep, and the broader holistic kind of all-encompassing CX. I would imagine that I guess it's relatively easy. This is a question, but I'm going to put it like a statement. I'm guessing it's relatively easier to spot someone who's chosen an area. I'm the data CX person. Yeah, I'm an expert, and yep, you can spot that skill and all the stuff they have. If it's the broader CX person, how does talent management identify talent in CX? What does that even? I mean, what is that? Is it just you gotta? I mean, as a person, you get a gut feel, but as an organization, does the organization spot CX talent? Do they recognize it?
Look, this has been one of those like career dilemmas, I would say, specifically in spotting talent, as you say, because again, I always take a people-centered lens on everything, and talent management practices, for the most part, have turned more into a science, and we've lost the people element, I would say. Because again, it's processes, it's certain tools, it's certain assessments that you use, and then you're like, oh, there we go, that you're talent, you're not talent. For me, like personally, like I don't look at it that way, because the understanding is of talent management is you actually have to get to know your talent, and get to know your talent is you actually have to interact with people, you have to spend time with them, you have to step into their world for a bit of time to really be able to to form an understanding of what this person aspires to, what they're capable of, what do they want to do, and can they bridge or move into different areas, disciplines, and so on. And so what I've seen is in these forums where we talk about talent, review talent, succession, potential next roles, and so on. Unfortunately, what I've seen is there has been, the stigma around CX being more specialized. So it's a discipline that, and I think, organizations, or at least from my perspective, have defaulted to placing CX in that very specialized vertical as opposed to the broader. So when it comes to discussing individuals, and it's saying, well, X person, they're always going to do CX. And it's like, well, have you actually interacted with them? They've actually given a really amazing proposal for, this expansion or like an operation, process or something. And there's none of that understanding that goes in, because there's this paintbrush and that's at least what I've seen from kind of my lived experience. But then what has happened with me is I've interacted with some of these individuals on cross-functional projects, and they've lended their experience on areas that have nothing to do with their day-to-day job, and have tremendously added, a lot of impact and value on, the ways that we map out, whether it's, even HR processes, like, looking at how do we actually, how does a performance management process interface, with the organization, to what are some of the pitfalls we're not looking at? What are some of the areas that we're not maybe paying attention to even redesigning certain surveys for us to help us really actually be a lot better, at, looking at those insights. So to me, that kind of individual really kind of moves out of that specialized bucket. And then I can start to look at that person as even potentially, who knows, maybe that person may actually move in and do like an HR stint. Maybe that's, a career move that they want to get exposure to, and they can bring some of their CX into EX. But we don't typically see those moves happening, because we tend to, people get put in boxes, and we tend to sort of operate in that very confined, scope.
Mhm. So it sounds to me like, in a sense, in big corporates, like where you've worked, um, being a CX person is almost a double-edged sword in terms of your career. One, you get specialized. So if you are one of the CX specialized people, as you said, it kind of makes sense for you. That's all you want to be, is the data person. You can be the data expert, and you're good.
Yeah,
If you're the holistic, broad spectrum CX person, you could apply that stuff, but you're already boxed in another area.
yeah.
So you might not get the opportunity to do some of those things that you've just talked about, to spread your wings, and to inject what you know in other places.
I mean, I would say, and this I mean, this advice would span for anyone really, because, in that sense, when people do get boxed in, it's really then take the reins and drive your career forward yourself. And the best way is to actually get people to see you in action. So the more you can step into projects, the more people can actually take on stuff that's completely outside of their, day-to-day realm, let's say, that then gives, decision makers or executives around a round table more of a like actual demonstrated experience of, okay, well, this person has actually stepped in, they've taken on this project, this has got nothing to do with their kind of day to day, but they've demonstrated these competencies, so we can see the agilities there. That's where we can then, yes, take a risk on people. That's the whole point of talent management, is to grow people and to develop them. So if we're not stretching people and taking a risk per se, yeah, so I would say like that's where the opportunity is, but probably even more so for individuals in the CX field in these kind of environments, because they will have to go out of their way to put their hand up for projects, or sign up for things, or get more visible, I would say. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. When you think about your colleagues, in HR generally, do you think they get what CX EX actually is?
I would say it's a mixed bag, not across the board. Some probably have a very, simplistic view of what CX, and it's primarily customer surveys. I think for some, they've just like boxed it as that's where we get our customer information from, and that's pretty much it. Um, it depends kind of which discipline within HR. I think what I've seen is the more HR individuals interact with colleagues from CX, the more they actually learn, what it really brings. And they're actually leveraging their CX colleagues' input into some of those, HR processes. So I've seen that in terms of like a personal example I have is I partnered very closely with a CX colleague on a rewards and recognition redesign. So that was again, let's really look at this. And this is not part of his, day-to-day work per se, but it was again looking at, okay, if we were to redesign this whole like recognition program, how would we go about it? What would be some of the inputs we need to look at? So this was me then putting my kind of ideas aside to say, okay, let me now come in fresh blank slate and let's like brainstorm and design this together. And there are areas and inputs that I wouldn't have considered because they've got a lot more exposure to the business. They're working more cross, operationally. There's certain insights from certain, customer data that could, be giving us indication of whether our recognition program is working or not. So all of these things came into play. So for me, that was such a rich experience, and then that showed me that we're missing a lot, in terms of our HR, process designs or redesigns, because we do it in a very cocooned HR bubble most of the time. Yeah.
hmm hmm So, seven, what did you say, 5 or 7 years ago, you formally, I guess, start to see, oh, there are some CX
Yeah.
real roles and whatever CX means and that sort of thing. In your journey, as you came into it, was it just, you know, this is what they have, so I'll learn about it? When did it kind of click, if it did click? I'm sure it did, but when did it kind of click that CX not only is a real thing out there, but it's actually valuable? What is it that got you to see that, it's worthwhile having?
So I would say, I think a few years ago, I started to dip more into the world of like culture and culture transformation. And again, that's one of those big fuzzy words that, what is culture? And that's where it really landed at home for me that what we're trying to do is two sides of the same coin, which was customer and employee. And the whole CX EX equation became crystal clear in that span of work. Because again, everything that we were doing to improve on the employee experience was to ultimately make sure that we had return customers, there was customer loyalty, there was, lifetime value. So all of those terms that I started to become more familiar with through the CX, terminology was a direct reflection of also some of the work that we're doing on the employee side. So in terms of rewards and recognition, in terms of like clear performance objectives, in terms of, the workspace environment, safety at work, all of those things that we were doing so that our employees were able to focus on the guest experience, to be able to, have their minds clear of all the, other headaches. So if we were to take all of that off of their plate so they could truly focus on the guest experience and then be able to measure that, right? So I could see the correlation there. It was really strong and very clear. And that then showed me that, even when organizations stand on these like big, podiums and talk about like culture, it's not one or the other. You cannot like they're both like your employee experience and your customer experience are going to go hand in hand because it's literally kind of a life cycle that feeds into each other. And so it showed me that we can't be solutioning on one end like only customer and then completely ignoring your internal, your employee experience. That's going to backfire. And if you're only focusing on your processes but you're ignoring your customer, obviously then that you're not going to have
Mm,
repeat customers and loyalty.
mm,
So that was a big eye opener for me, I would say, and that really then got me personally more bought in and more engaged in the whole, work of whether it's culture, CX, EX, like that whole world is now something that I'm very curious about. Yeah.
okay, okay. And you mentioned the project, the rewards and recognition project, and you work with a colleague or two from CX space. how did you seek them out? Did you happen to be placed on a team where CX was there, or did they seek you out? How did the collaboration actually start?
So yeah, so the way the collaboration started was they were actually identified as one of the as part of our talent management process as some of those individuals that wanted to get broader exposure and broader experiences. So we wanted to move them a bit out of that specialist capacity. And at the same time, we were going through this, culture program. They were individuals that had embodied, the values of the organization. They were looked up to as role models. So they had the behaviors that, and, the stakeholder buy-in and, the articulation and all of that. And it was like, well, let's take X person and now give them this development opportunity. So this would be a great project to now. So it was partly an outcome of the talent discussions, and also their own willingness and their own openness to try new things and be involved in their own development. So it was kind of yeah, a win-win on both ends, because as much as I'd learned, they've also taken away a lot from, like being exposed to a lot of HR processes and the ins and outs and intricacies that they wouldn't have seen, from their side of the fence.
Hmm. One of the things that you don't hear, I rarely hear a CX person talk about talent management in that sense. We talk about employee experience, but not specifically talent management, succession planning. We dabble into it. What is this? Could this be? Would you recommend if you had a holistic CX person? They're looking at all kinds of things. They're concerned with, the culture, the everything, all the things that you just mentioned. Would you recommend them seeking out talent management as a target for what they do? And if you do, how generally would they go about doing that? What would be the way of talking to a talent management function person?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, well, I mean, it depends how different organizations are set up, but I would say for the most part, I think by now, like, and this is probably where the evolution also of CX is moving to, right? So talent management was also one of those terms that, 10, 20 years ago, no one really was talking about, because it was all one HR. But then we needed to kind of, really carve out that space of, okay, this is more the forward-looking piece of development, of future succession, and so on. So I would say, it's definitely part of most organizations' roles right now that they would have the internal processes around development plans and career discussions. But the key main thing I would say for any individual is make your aspirations known early on. So, to have those one-to-one conversations with their direct manager. Uh, what I've seen a lot of individuals, and this is more maybe mid, kind of early career to mid career, is they're still waiting for someone to come and tell them like this is what you need to do next, or this is who you need to speak to. And while ideally, yes, in great organizations, you may have that, thought through and planned out, most of the time it's not fully fleshed out. So that's where kind of people really need to take that step. So it's really making sure their line manager is aware, and then finding out who that person in your organization is. Like, is that the HR head? Is there a specific talent management person? And actually having a career discussion, actually sitting down and having a conversation around aspirations, skills, strengths, development areas. What feedback can I get, from whom, from others? And hey, this is a role that I aspire to, like 3, 5 years down the line. What are those, milestones that I need to get there? And then working on a plan to move towards that, because then the organization is aware, and the organization then knows, like, okay, this person has made it clear, this is where they're aiming for. Now from a person, they just need to perform, and they need to make sure that they're delivering, and they're, exceeding their team's expectations, so that they're on the radar, right? So that's your part of the bargain. And then from the organization, they're aware now that this person has made it clear that they want to broaden their horizons. And then in those forums and roundtable discussions, that's where then at least that HR person or the leaders are aware of that person's plan, and they can then start to take that into consideration. But, the worst thing I've seen is that when people don't make their intentions known, and they assume that the rest of the organizations are mind readers, and that's really, it doesn't happen that way. And unfortunately, because in fields that tend to get cast into these specialized boxes, you do have to become vocal and visible and make it very, like just take that step to make your intentions more clear.
Right. Okay. So I get it. As an individual, this is how you should interact with talent management, or some advice there. But as a CX person who wants to impact talent management itself, I want to apply
Right.
CX or EX to talent management as, I don't know, project or whatever. I just want to help them with this perspective that I have. Is there What would be a good first conversation to have? How would they approach talent management? What advice would you give them just to approach talent management on that front?
Definitely approach talent management and definitely find out from the talent management team or people in the organization what the sentiment on the street is. I think that would be a great indicator, just like how we measure customer surveys and look at customer data and insights. So from a CX professional's perspective, they can then use that same angle to say, well, let's look at your organizational data and let's sit together and really kind of just have an honest conversation around this. And that's where I think, without it being a directed sort of conversation of, okay, you need to do XYZ, but more, let's just have a chat about, well, you've been trying all of these processes, or you've launched this and did that, but your results are still showing us that we've got gaps in these areas. So perhaps we look at it from a different perspective. This is where they kind of come in with another lens. So maybe using some of those data insights as a starting point for the conversation, and also really just testing the ground with employees on the ground. Because what I've found is, a lot of the time, and this is where HR tends to get a bad rap sometimes, of designing in a vacuum. So designing on, let's say, a high kind of rise building, executive floor, a solution that does not work on the ground in an operations environment. And I think this is where, from a CX professional, can come in with that angle and with that know-how, to be able to help bridge that gap between the conceptual part and the operational. Like, how do we actually make this work? So those are
Hmm.
kind of, I would say, key areas that would really help drive that forward.
Right. Um, I think you've answered this already about maybe CX people being pigeonholed and trying to break out of it. But from in a general sense, if this is registered with you at all, what has been the weakness of CX people, and what's their blind spot?
I mean, I can only speak for kind of my lived experience for the moment, but I would say one key one is lack of visibility. Just lack of visibility and lack of putting themselves forward or putting themselves out there in forums with leaders or with so what I tend to see is, because they are already quite busy and overwhelmed with a lot of their projects, and there's a lot going on. It spans kind of multiple disciplines and perspectives. So they're usually really busy in what they're doing on the day to day. They don't tend to spend as much time on their own personal brand. So I would say that would be a key one, because I've had several conversations with a few people, interestingly, that were in the CX field, around personal branding and around how
Hmm.
can you stand out and how can you actually start to be more vocal about what it is you do. So not just staying under the umbrella of my function, but now I'm an agent of change in an organization, like starting to kind of take what it is that you do and really help the organization see it from a results perspective. And I think that's where a lot of CX professionals can really kind of benefit, is from not just being in that, kind of cocoon, but like, how do I now make what I do visible and demonstrate the impact to an organization more
Right.
clearly?
Right. I got it. I know that succession planning, or playing some role in that, was a big part, or is a big part of your job. And I know that you've worked for organizations that talk quite a bit and have as part of their values customer experience is kind of a main thing in a real sense. So they say, we're super customer centric, um, uh, and take them at their word for that. When it comes to looking for people to move up to replace, some high position, is a CX point of view something that you actually look, not you, but as a
Yeah.
function that you
Organ
spot and say it's a crucial component for someone to move up in this very customer centric organization?
Not typically, if I'm being very, very honest. Although I really see a need for it to be part of those core, competencies or core skill sets that we start to identify and look for. I remember back in the oil and gas days, like, and this is more than 10, 15 years ago, so it was like president of a region, and we were looking at succession for future, GMs or like senior leaders in role. And at that time, he made it a clear mandate for him that everyone that moves into one of those roles would have spent a stint of time in sales, because for him that was where you interfaced and interacted with your customer a lot more intimately. So again, they didn't, maybe the CX language wasn't there then, but for him that was a requirement. Like, you had to do a role in sales before you came in to even be considered for a successor for one of those like executive roles. And I really think, like, as we progress and in this day and age, and now with just the, again, the importance of, especially in this age of social media and the age of, you can't hide anything. Like, there's nothing organizations, as much PR as they try to do in damage control, like, if you're not truly genuinely looking after, really nurturing that relationship with your customer and your employees, yeah, you're like, in this time we're in, like, that's kind of a recipe for disaster for organizations. So I really truly believe that as you're developing leaders to move in, those succession ranks, that needs to become part of their, core, components of their readiness and of their exposure, whether or not it's a full-time role that they do, but or getting them exposed. Like, it should be really part of those requirements. I haven't seen it quite yet. I know it's discussed more in terms of, like, do they have, customer kind of a customer focused approach. There's, it's vague language that I see, as opposed to more specific experiences, that what is it that this person needs to do to be clear and sure that they are now operating with that lens, as a leader in sales, or as a leader in operations, or as a leader in, and I don't think we've yet, at least from what I've seen so far.
Mm-hmm. If just using that as a kind of a scale, if you had to say which of these would be maybe more important for an organization, one is to have CX people or the CX perspective injected into other functions, HR, marketing, sales, whatever else, or to have those other functions perspectives injected into CX in that organization. Which would you say is seems more
Hmm.
prudent?
Ah, I mean, I think at this point right now, I would err on the side of having more CX people injected into the functions,
Hmm.
as opposed to the other way around. I think, yeah, because I at least what I've seen is there's been a lot more, um, yeah, things are just moving in a very fast, automated, process-driven way that tends to, just because there's, speed required, and you're, needing to deliver, and, it's just the human experience piece gets missed out completely. And this is where I see, like, a sort of a gaping void, to be honest, right now. So I would rather have that perspective sitting in different functions, in different, right now, and at the same time, there can be a, during that time
Mm.
they're also learning, right? So they're learning, and they're sharing that experience with, sales and marketing and HR and finance and IT, and, all of these functions. But yeah, it really needs to kind of infuse every element of, the organization, like, cut across. Like, it needs to be that red thread, the glue. Like, I really see it as that, like, the connective tissue that really kind of runs through an organization. If we are really to deliver on the promises. Like if organizations are going to deliver on the statements, the big statements that they say to their customers and to their employees, then there has to be a consistency in how we approach that. And I really feel like, having a more connected view of all the journeys and how they all map together and how the touch points work and the impact and the measurements, and that needs to be, a lot more cohesive. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like six in one hand, half a dozen in the other. So one of the reasons that CX roles, functions kind of it became a function, which you could argue became a silo, which didn't have the
Mm,
exposure and other kinds of things, is because to protect the perspective, that people perspective, it kind of had to exist on its own to be able to do what it's doing. If you
mm,
took individuals who have that perspective and injected them into parts of the organization that don't have that perspective, the weights of those functional points of view are so heavy that it would
mm,
potentially override that point of view that the CX person sort of has. And I think there's a balance there. You can see it some organizations who kind of, you really there's a CX, maybe that's where the matrix organization kind of comes in or other kinds of things. But there isn't a perfect answer for this. How do you balance this? And I think this is one of the dilemmas that CX people tend to face. How do I keep my perspective, but at the same time inject
mm.
it into the organization where, history, tradition, whatever, old boys network, all kinds of things are there, which kind of get in the way, and we're trying to overcome that. So,
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, and there's some of the frustrations that I've heard from, several like people like within the CX field of where the organizations don't get it. Again, they talk the talk, but then when it comes to decision making, when it comes to, actually putting money on the table or
mm,
actually like going behind certain proposals or actions or initiatives, that's where things sort of falter. So yeah, there is still room for, a lot more education. I would say even within internally, like within organizations, just understanding, like what CX does and what CX is and, how it really lives and breathes within every aspect of the business. Because, at the end of the day, that's, organizations exist because of their customers. So if there
mm,
was no one buying, if there was no one coming to your business or experiencing what you offer, then you don't really exist. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for more education, and at the same time for CX professionals to maybe rebrand or to kind of work on their personal positioning within organizations in a more
mhm.
effective way. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's useful. So I've heard a couple of things in this conversation. Number one, CX kind of has maybe two internal, I don't know, persona types. One is the deep dive specialist in some skill set area, and the other one is the more holistic. The interesting bit is the more holistic you are, potentially the less visible you are because you
Mm,
don't really fit any particular place. You've talked quite a lot about the personal branding. CX people need to work on their not just how CX how CX is used in the organization, but their personal brand,
right.
because to
Yeah.
some degree it's a new field. They're kind of at risk as a new
Mm,
field in an organization. Other functions and departments have a long histories. They're all over the place. They're just the standard part of way the business
right.
does
Yeah.
things. CX is a new perspective, generally speaking, for an organization. So they need individuals, CX practitioners need to work on their personal brand. And that's to say, even in an organization that talks the right thing, that is customer centric, wants to be customer centric, just being CX may not necessarily be enough. You need to work on a personal brand. And one way of doing that is to inject yourself, your perspective, but yourself, your career into other areas that are maybe more established in doing other things. So that's kind of what some of the couple of things that I've heard. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's a great summary of what we went through. Absolutely. And I feel it's an untapped truly an untapped field, like an untapped treasure, like within organizations. I'm looking at it more from the people, like from the HR side. I think there's so much value that can come from collaboration from these two, these two functions. Because that's where, and again, I saw it firsthand with like the recognition program, a few other process, redesigns, helping HR professionals really step out of their fight, flight, operational, like short term, kind of mindset, and really zoom out and really kind of design solutions that take their employees' full experience into perspective. I think that's where also potentially for a lot of CX professionals that can be kind of maybe a detour on the way to bigger and better things, but also can gain them a lot of internal perspective on the whole employee journey and employee experience.
Yeah, I think in many or some organizations, when we say customer experience, you can argue what's included in that, but there's a whole school of thought that I mean everyone knows obviously the employee is you can't have, as you said, you can't have CX without EX, and there's a whole school of thought that the EX actually should come first and then the CX will follow. There's another school of thought which says CX is the focus and the EX kind of comes from that focus, but it's all kind of getting to the same place. But I think this has been a fascinating discussion. I think some parts of this might be of interest to, of interest to CX people who are in their careers, maybe mid-career. We have quite a few, let's just call them function switchers in CX. So people who,
Hmm.
at this stage of the game, there's some people who have had their whole career in something CX related, but there's a big group of people who started out in other kinds of functions
Right.
and then moved to CX. And it's kind of interesting. They chose it because they were excited about it, but at the same time, maybe they lost some of their personal brand along the way. So that might be some
Mm.
advice to take along. One of the big things of this is what's a personal brand for a CX person, and what does that brand mean for companies? Succession, new company, new
Yeah.
job, new whatever else. What is the brand of that? So yeah, that's very interesting. So
Yeah.
thanks a lot for that.
Well,
It's really appreciate it.
you're very welcome. I mean, I can talk about these things all day. I'm passionate about all of that. So, yeah, thank you for the opportunity and for, helping me also think through, some of those topics. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll look forward to speaking with you soon. See
Thank
you.
you. Thanks, Alpha.